Welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon Ellis. I'm the chair of the Project Working Group for the Preventing Homelessness Among Older Women Research Project. I'm also a member of the Eastern Metropolitan Partnership. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung people and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which Melbourne's eastern suburbs lie. We pay respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders, past and present, who have resided in the area and have been an integral part of the region's history. And we pay our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the people present with us today. Shortly, we will hear about the outcomes of the Preventing Homelessness Among Older Women Research Project after more than a year of careful work. This project is commissioned by the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance, EAHA for short. It has been delivered through funding from the Victoria
Because it's just press something. You can go. Okay, to resume.
We are joined by the project's lead researcher, Dr. Katrina Rayner, who is Principal Social Consultant with Umwelt. Kate, as she's called for short, will present to us shortly. Please check out the EHA website link in the chat for the project's Phase 1 report. The final report will also be published on the EHA website by the end of next week. Please note that today's presentation will be touching on several confronting themes such as family violence and trauma. Please feel free to take a break or exit if you need to, or reach out to the support contacts in the chat. Now for some general housekeeping. Chat info, please put the questions in the chat or Q&A function as we go through. These will be addressed by Kate at the end of her presentation. We've got over 100 people in the webinar today, so we may not be able to get to all questions, but we will try. During the Q&A session, we will be using the Mentimeter tool for interaction, which sounds very impressive. There will be a link for the chat for this. Feel free to use just the chat instead if you prefer. We'll be recording today's session. In the next week, will be uploaded to EHA's website, and the link will be shared with you all. We'd love for you to share this with your networks. I would like to now introduce Dr. Kate Rayner, who will be presenting the research findings. Thank you to Kate, and over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Let me just do a quick switcheroo. And we're sharing the right things. Excellent. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate, and I've had the great pleasure and privilege of leading this particular research project in collaboration with the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance for just over a year now. And it's wonderful to be here today presenting on the culmination of this work on this really important topic. And we've got 30 minutes today together to talk through some of the key findings and also to have some time at the end for question and answer. So I'll get into it. I can work out how to change the screen. There we go. So the agenda for today is I'm going to touch really briefly on the objectives of this particular research project and what we set out to achieve. I'm going to talk through the method and the approach really briefly, and then I'm going to focus my attention on the findings. So I'm going to be recapping a little bit of the phase 1 findings, which was really about understanding the context of homelessness in the Eastern Metropolitan region. I'm talking to older women and service providers about their experiences. And then I'm going to be focusing my attention on the bright, new, juicy findings of phase 2, which has really been focused on solutions and what are the nuts and bolts and the tangible things that we could be doing in the Eastern Metropolitan region, but also more broadly to address older women's homelessness and housing stress. And as we mentioned, there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So in terms of what this research project has set out to achieve, the aim of the project was to build the evidence-based preventative approaches that keep women over the age of 55 safe from homelessness. The goals within that were to provide a richer insight into this group and their experiences, to identify successful housing and service models and preventative approaches, to raise awareness about this incredibly important issue, and also to build the evidence base that EHA and anyone else can use when they're talking about solution recommendations. And when we talk about the Eastern Metropolitan region, we're talking about those purple suburbs out there on the east of Knox, Manningham, Maroondah, City of Monash, Whitehorse, and Yarra Ranges. And I know that I am preaching to the converted with anyone who is on this call, but just very briefly, why should we care about this topic? We know that across Australia, over 400,000 women over 45 are at risk of homelessness, based on some fantastic research by Lester and Faulkner in 2020 and updated since then. We know that homelessness exacerbates the challenges of aging, that aging while homeless is incredibly difficult. And that's really a multifaceted and intersectional issue. We know that planning a safe, fulfilling, dignified, and socially connected life is almost impossible in the context of housing insecurity and aging, and the individual impacts are profound across many different layers of being a human being. And if we zoom out of those really profound individual impacts, we also know that homelessness places burdens on social health and justice systems when we think more systemically. So what did we do in this research project, given that we know it's an incredibly important thing to be talking about? What we did is we talked to a lot of people. So in the phase 1 research process, we spoke to service providers, we spoke to older women with lived experience of homelessness, we sent out surveys, we crunched the numbers. And in the second phase, what we've been doing is another round of interviews with industry experts and 2 really interesting and valuable roundtable events that had panelists talking about key solutions and had a room full of people who were really invested in seeing if there was ways that they could apply them. And so it's been a really wonderful research approach that has been about delivering and developing findings, but has also very much been about bringing together partnerships and networks and letting the people who need to meet each other so that we can progress with some of these solutions. So what have we found out? And I'm going to recap the phase 1 findings really briefly now, and I apologize if some people on the call have been part of this process and they've seen this before, but I think it's really nice to give a little bit of context. So one of the key things we found, and this should probably not be a surprise, is that housing risk is really prevalent in the Eastern Metropolitan region. I think there's a perception that the eastern suburbs of Melbourne are really wealthy, and this is not somewhere where we need to be concentrating our resources or our services, but that's not the case. We know there's 150,000 women over 55 in the region, and about 5% of them, or 8,000 older women, are renting in the private sector, which we know is a really, really significant risk factor for housing stress and homelessness as people get older. And you can see some of the other stats on the slide as well. One of the most important findings, but also conceptual frameworks and talking points of this entire research project has been talking about pathways into homelessness. And I need to acknowledge that there are as many experiences of homelessness and pathways into homelessness as there are human beings experiencing it. It's an incredibly varied story and experience. But within that, we tend to find two key groups of older women experiencing homelessness in later life. And one of those groups are women experiencing a gradual pathway. And these are women who've spent decades with little or no housing satisfaction. They're often low-income renters. They've often been really insecurely connected to the labour force. They don't have a lot of social connections, and they've experienced a really profound and long-running experience of housing risk and health and mental health concerns. They've often reached out for help many times over the course of their lives, but have not been able to receive the help they need. So that's one group of people. There's also another pathway that we talk about, and is probably the most prevalent narrative we see in the media. And that's the vision you have of the relatively middle-class woman who's often been married for a long time, has often been a homeowner for a long time, has often worked for a lot of her career as well, or a lot of her life. And then she receives or she experiences a shock or a series of shocks later in life, like a divorce, like loss of a job, like a serious illness or an injury. And that really precipitates a rapid movement from securely housed to homeless or insecurely housed. And for these women, a huge part of this narrative and this experience is reluctance to seek help, and a huge sense of shame. And often they've never interacted with a social welfare system. So a lot of confusion about what you would even do to reach out for support when you needed it. And these are some of the stories that we heard that very much reflected these different experiences. So we had the privilege of capturing Julia's story, who talked about marrying young and staying home with her children, with her son when he was little, of leaving a marriage with very little, of experiencing a series of abusive relationships and a lot of housing insecurity. She spoke about moving through Centrelink payments, working in retail jobs and short-term jobs, before finally finding a home with a proper lease, and then losing that home when the landlord sold that flat. And that real sense of loss of security when you feel out of control, when you've lost that housing in your life. She spoke about feeling really unsafe and disconnected in a home with her son and his son's mates, being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and then digging into a lot of her superannuation and savings during the pandemic, and feeling and experiencing a very long-term experience of being insecurely housed and unable to look after herself as well as she could have had she had better access to housing. We also had the privilege of hearing from Grace, who's probably a better example of that rapid pathway that we talked about before. And she spoke about having a full-time job, owning her own unit, having a mortgage, her experience of being bullied at work, and quitting her job, not being able to afford her mortgage. So this kind of stress is starting to layer on top of each other. She spoke of ending up living in her car, parked in public spaces where she wouldn't be seen, wanting to reach out with to her family, but being too ashamed to tell them, and then getting to that very, very pointy end of crisis, and calling her daughter on the point of feeling very suicidal and having her family and a doctor intervene. And this is a really good news story, or a relatively good news story, because Grace accessed crisis accommodation and now has access to social housing, which has had a profound impact on her life. But both of these stories encourage us to see the very human and holistic experience of homelessness and housing stress, and also to think about all of those touch points before crisis occurs, where we could be intervening and where we could have a really profound impact on someone's life if we're reaching them at the right point in time. So I think it's always a really nice thing to emphasize the human lived experience of any of these topics as an important way of framing any of the solutions that we come to based on that. Another one of the key findings from the phase 1 research, and again, this probably won't come as a surprise to anyone who works in housing or homelessness, is that services are insufficient. There's not enough housing, and those services and housing systems are really difficult to navigate. And so we heard from both older women with lived experience and from service providers that there's lots of concerns about eligibility. There's lots of concerns about finding information, of bringing things together, of being dealt with in silos rather than being considered as one human being with all of the different needs that they have. And we particularly heard that even if you do have access to homelessness services, it doesn't help you a lot if you can't exit that service into crisis and social or affordable housing. And so there's a real dearth of housing opportunities and housing access across the board, but also in the Eastern Metropolitan region. And the final thing I'll touch on before I move to phase 2, which is very much about those solutions, is just that in the first phase, we talked about a huge diversity of potential solutions across housing and health and finance and social connection. And there were so many great things already happening and so many great things we could be doing in this really cross-sectoral manner. But what we decided to focus on in phase 2 were solutions that A, had a really big bang for buck. So how can we support as many women as well as possible? And B, solutions that we don't know enough about yet. So ideas that potentially aren't being researched to the same degree at the moment, or haven't had as much research historically done on them. And based on that, we came into phase 2, looking at accessing underutilized dwellings or homes. And I must acknowledge that a lot of work is already being done about accessing underutilized land, particularly from local councils. So we wanted to take a slightly different focus. And we also wanted to look at cheaper accommodation in retirement villages or independent living units, just because this was an area where there was a lot of knowledge gaps. And so that's what we took forward in this process. And that's what we've been working on for the last couple of months. And talking about underutilized homes and buildings is incredibly exciting and an incredibly ripe area because there's just so many. There's so many. We know from a report from Prosperity Australia in 2019 that there's potentially about 64,000 properties that are speculatively vacant, which means that they're not used for most of the year in Victoria alone. And Prosperity Australia estimates that those empty properties could house over 185,000 people. So not all of them will be appropriate, but even a proportion of that is a big number in the context of the housing need that we have. We also know that across the Eastern Metropolitan region, over 37,000 sole residents, so people living on their own, aged 60 years and above, live in dwellings with 2 or more bedrooms. And again, not every one of those people will want to share their homes with other people. But even again, a proportion of that is an incredibly valuable resource that we should be thinking about. And so these are some of the key solutions. And I'm going to talk through, I think there's 7, very briefly, with an opportunity for us to explore this more in the Q&A and in the report itself. But we've chosen these 7 particular solutions amongst many, with a particular focus on the role of local government as a research project that's been funded by the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance, which is a conglomeration of local governments. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a multitude of different ways that we could be cutting this problem or we could be responding to it. But just to give you that caveat, that's kind of where some of the thought process of the solutions that we're focused on has come from. And so one of the key things that we heard, and we had the great privilege of having Dr. Meg Montague to speak to us as one of our roundtable participants. And Dr. Meg Montague is part of Home Share Australia and New Zealand Alliance, or HANZA. And one of the recommendations we came to was funding a project with HANZA or another provider to trial support for home sharing for older people in the Eastern Metropolitan region. And home sharing is a mutually beneficial arrangement that can support both the home provider, so the person who owns the home, and a home sharer, so someone who moves in to live with them. And there's a particular provider in Victoria working at the moment called Shared Lives, who are supporting home sharing in Victoria and matching seniors who need little help to live independently with a compatible companion who needs housing. And that's one way that this can work. But essentially, the model is based on a mutually beneficial arrangement between a home sharer and a home provider. And it allows people to continue to live in the region and access housing that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford. It allows people to share the costs and their bills. And it also kind of tackles that question of loneliness and social exclusion that we often hear about in the context of an aging population. And as we heard before, there's 37 households with 2 or more empty bedrooms in the region. So this is absolutely something that could be incredibly applicable within the EMR. So it would be very exciting to see something like that happen in this region. Another great human being that we came across as part of this research process is Samantha Goss from Homeground Real Estate. And she spoke about the really great work that Homeground Real Estate is doing as a social enterprise property manager. And essentially, they property manage homes, rental homes, and all of the fees that come from that property management service flow directly into Launch Housing, which is one of the biggest housing and homelessness service providers in Victoria. And so just existing as a way of funneling funds into that organisation is a great thing. But on top of that, they've built a model with an ATO tax ruling, which allows rental providers who list their property with Homeground Real Estate at a discounted rate to claim that gap between the market rate and what they're renting it at as a tax deduction. So this isn't directly tapping into homes that would otherwise be empty, but it is potentially taking homes that would otherwise have been rented at a market rate and moving it into affordable rental, which I think is an incredible opportunity. And it opens doors up to mum and dad investors who may have wanted to do that social contribution, but didn't know how to do it. So I think this is another way that we can be thinking at the kind of fine grain level about tapping into this resource. I've put this one in really quickly, but it's just more as an exciting thing that one of our recommendations was increasing flexibility in the way that we treat granny flats or ancillary dwellings. Because currently in Victoria, you can have a secondary dwelling, but it has to be occupied by someone who's dependent on the main household. So a teenage child or maybe an elderly parent. But as of next month, families will no longer require a planning permit to build a small second home on their property. And there will be no restrictions on how that secondary home is used. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity. We've seen in Sydney, where this policy is already in place, that's one of the most significant contributions to affordable rental housing in that city. So I think that this will be another way of tapping into underutilized dwellings and backyards across Victoria that could have great potential for older women. To think about not just underutilized homes, but to turn our attention to underutilized buildings, I think there's some really wonderful examples of this being thought about in a really practical and innovative way. And so one of the things that we could be doing is supporting building owners with a temporarily unused building to generate meanwhile use temporary crisis accommodation for older women at risk of homelessness. And there are developers, there are property owners who fall into this bucket, who might be going through a really long planning application process, or they might be land banking or building banking while waiting for other things to happen in their property portfolio. There's a whole range, or they might have owned that building, but it's no longer useful to them, or it's surplus to their needs. So what could we be doing to these buildings that would otherwise just be sitting empty to make sure that we're tapping into them as a meanwhile use? And a really great example of that is the Lake House, which is a repurposed aged care facility owned by Casper Care in South Melbourne. And it's providing short-term crisis and transitional accommodation for 40 older women at a time. And that's a collaboration between the private sector and local government, the YWCA, National Housing Australia, and they've set up a model where that not-for-profit housing provider is renting that building for $1 a year and providing an incredible service and support to older women while they look for their next housing option, or they support women to find their next long-term housing option. And there's another one I think that's happening in Knox at the moment as well. So it's exciting to see that kind of thing as a model is being replicated and could be done in other locations. And I've just thrown this one in here because one of the key things that we talked about in this whole topic of tapping into underutilized buildings and homes is the concept of the difficulty of finding the unicorn. That there's all these buildings out there, there's all these homes out there, but we don't know which ones are vacant. We don't know which ones are amenable to affordable housing. We don't know how to bring them together. But if we could find those social value unicorns and brought them together with the right resources and the right people, then we could do something really special. And Queensland has just done something, I think, really exciting about finding their housing unicorns, and that they've set up a housing opportunities portal where anyone can submit their ideas about buildings that they might know of parcels of land that they might want to see used for a period of time. And it just becomes the central way of bringing together those different resources and looking at how they could be matched up. And it's already starting to result in the Queensland government purchasing parcels of land or purchasing existing retirement villages and transitioning them into affordable housing. So could we do something similar in Victoria as a collaboration between VicGov and local council? That's something that I think is a pretty low-hanging fruit that would be really exciting to see happen. So they're all of our underutilized homes and building solutions. I'm going to touch on the retirement village and independent living unit topic now and just take us through a few of those solutions, and then we'll go to questions and answers. So we talked about retirement villages, and there are almost 500 retirement villages in Victoria. A 2-bedroom retirement village sells for about $480,000 in Australia. And there's absolutely a perception that we heard throughout this research process that retirement villages are only for wealthy people, and that there's this vision of the lifestyle product. It's got the pool and the wraparound services, and that's very much the case for some retirement villages. But there's still a lot of models of not-for-profit independent living units for older people, or even for-profit rental models or manufactured housing estates that still fall into that bucket of retirement village and still can be affordable stock, or could be supported to be affordable stock for older women at risk of homelessness. There's also a perception that older women who would be at risk of homelessness don't currently live in retirement villages, but that's not what the research tells us either. But there are women who would otherwise have been in a really risky or precarious position who are in this housing typology. So it really needs to be part of our discussion when we talk about solutions in this area. And one of them, and this kind of links into the previous theme, or one of the ways we could think about this, is whether we could be using council-owned land for independent living units or retirement villages. And this is something that has quite a lot of precedent in the way that we deliver not-for-profit or affordable retirement living. And what it relies on is identifying existing council-owned land or buildings with the capacity to host affordable retirement village-style housing for older women. And potentially you could link that with state government funding through something like the Big Housing Build, and generate housing through that model. And we did hear as part of our process of the Lancefield housing units being managed by Winteringham Housing in partnership with Macedon Ranges Shire Council, with funding coming from the Big Housing Build. So it's an example of where it's already happening. And just because we're talking about the EMR, Lionswood, which is a retirement village in Maroondah, is actually on land that was gifted by the then city of Ringwood, and now city of Maroondah, in the 1960s. And so this kind of model has been around for a very long time and could potentially lead to more affordable retirement village style housing. I throw this in there as a thing to discuss in terms of the role of local council in providing affordability within retirement villages. And that's just the idea that when we're negotiating for affordable housing as part of Section 173 agreements or planning approval processes in Victoria, there is a mechanism for negotiating affordable housing outcomes. Could we be applying that to any new retirement villages that come through? Most of the research around Section 173 agreements and affordable housing negotiations as part of planning processes has found that it's actually an incredibly long and drawn out and painful and not particularly effective process. But I have faith that these processes are starting to change. And the more that we embed that in our planning processes, the more capacity we have for seeing better outcomes over the long term. And I know that in Glen Ira, having those affordable housing negotiation systems in place was a key factor in delivering affordable housing and also in a planning scheme amendment for the East Village. So that kind of model could apply itself to new retirement village construction. I think this is my final one, which is just acknowledging that we actually have quite a few retirement villages across Australia, across this region, that are aging and have previously provided a lot of affordable housing options, but are increasingly being transitioned, either from affordable retirement to more expensive retirement living options through being renovated and upsold and moved into a different ownership structure, or they're just transitioning away from retirement villages into other forms of housing completely. And that's a loss of a really important resource. So we should be identifying where these particular housing models exist and trying to retain them or transition them into something else that's affordable as well. And to go back to Queensland for a moment, in Toowoomba, there was a former retirement village which has been turned into social homes purchased by the Palaszczuk government to continue to provide affordable housing. And that's just one example of where that's being thought about. So I think that's a really important way of acknowledging that we do have naturally occurring affordable housing that is retirement village focused, and we need to make sure that we don't lose it. These are the solutions we talked about, because I figure I've given you a lot of information in very quick succession, and so it's good to have that as a visual cue. And I think that I'm running on time. I am. Well, if that's the case, I know that we said that we would do a Mentimeter, but we've made a unilateral decision that that's more complexity than we need. So we're just going to go with a open comment, like write your questions or comments into the chat. No one can speak, can they? No one can speak. So write your questions into the chat, and we can go from there instead. And one thing I would like to encourage is write your questions if you have them, but also if you have particular recommendations or ideas about how any of these ideas could apply to your organization or your LGA, or particular buildings or organizations that are already doing this work, then chuck that in there as well, because it's an incredibly valuable resource to be crowdsourcing these different solutions and these different mechanisms as we go along. So yeah, encourage you to do that as well. But as we move to the Q&A, what do I do?
Round in front.
Excellent.
Apologies, everyone. We've just got 2 questions so far, but I'm thinking they'll pop up now that you start asking. How will the new granny flat planning changes impact this particular group?
Yeah, it's hard to know. So I know that in New South Wales, opening up granny flats, ancillary dwellings, just on a broad scale across all cohorts, had a substantial impact on the number of affordable rentals in Sydney. I think also in New South Wales broadly, but particularly in Sydney. And so just on like a really broad brush scale, there will be more supply. That's positive. When we talk about granny flats and we talk about older women specifically, I guess there's questions of accessibility, and there's questions about exploitation potentially, because some of these rental arrangements with granny flats are potentially less structured than you might see with other homes. But I mean, that's a risk of any form of rental arrangement. So I think there might be some risks in that, but there will also be new housing arriving, so that's a good thing. One thing we know about older women trying to find rental housing is that technology gap is an issue. And so being able to actually find those opportunities is a bit challenging for this cohort, more than you might see in other cohorts. And that's where having really good real estate agents or a social enterprise property manager who could bring these groups together would be a really valuable way of making sure that this is not only an increase in number of stock, but also an increase in the social value that comes from that stock.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can you give us any ideas around funding options aside from state government or federal government?
Yeah. It depends what the model is, because the reason we go with state or federal funding is because it's not a profitable enterprise to do not-for-profit housing delivery. And so if you continue to do not-for-profit affordable housing and you're not going with state or federal funding, then potentially you could look at philanthropists. And philanthropic funding is coming onto the table to support initiatives like this. You can also look at some of the largest scale superannuation funds or social enterprise funding mechanisms that would potentially not be funding like public housing, but could, as part of a cross-subsidization process, be funding affordable housing. So there are options for those kind of for-purpose funding models to be part of the play. And then beyond that, funding models, if you're going for if you're still trying to keep things as affordable as possible, often a not-for-profit housing provider would be thinking, can we fund it internally by building market rate or affordable housing, and then using the profit from that process to cross-subsidize more of that social housing process? But the short answer is, if it's super subsidized, it's really tricky to find the funding. So it's about being as creative as possible.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. Has housing for older First Nation women been considered in this report?
Yes, it has. It has been a bit of a gap in terms of the involvement we've had. We've tried really, really hard to have First Nations lived experience and First Nations service providers as part of the process. And we have had to some degree, but that would be absolutely something that we'd want to see more of, and is something worth acknowledging in the research process. We very much thought about First Nations perspectives and solutions as part of the first phase of research, and some really important insights, thinking specifically about First Nations communities, was actually the fact that in talking about older women, we often talk about women over 55 when we talk about a broader cohort, but when we talk about First Nations older women, we really should be looking at 45 and older, and that's for a number of different reasons. But a lot of the, I guess, overlapping health implications that we often see with First Nations communities mean that we need to be having that conversation earlier. So absolutely, we've been thinking about different needs, and also absolutely a lot of the solutions that we talk about in this second phase would be applicable to people who are First Nations, but we haven't done a specific cut of this solution only for First Nations older women.
Thank you. What about women with disability or other needs?
I love the intersectional questions. Yes, we have specifically taken a lens of disability in this research, and in fact, one of the biggest findings from the first phase of research was the really, really importance of thinking about the intersection between aged care, the NDIS and pensions, and disability support payments, and how you can't talk about housing and homelessness without also talking about NDIS and disability. They're intrinsically linked. So that's a really strong theme in phase one. In terms of having a specific solution for people with disabilities in the second phase, again, we haven't done cohort specific cutting of solutions, but that doesn't mean that any of these solutions couldn't be adapted or tweaked to make sure that accessibility is embedded within it.
Fantastic, thank you. Was the cooperative housing model considered?
Yes, it was. And that was probably number 3 when we did the list of solutions. We went, retirement villages, underutilized homes, cooperative housing. Damn it. Didn't quite make it through the mix.
Thank you.
So absolutely an important one, but not specific in this one.
How do we go about identifying underutilized properties?
Yeah, good question. It's tricky. It's really hard. One of the ways you can do it is through a housing portal, like they do in Queensland, and trying to crowdsource that information. Another thing that came up really strongly was the importance of networking, of just most people who are working in housing and homelessness and property development know a bajillion other people working in the same sector, and they talk. So human connection, a big one. A plug for a piece of research that I did with a colleague a couple of years ago that used Google Maps and AI and technical things that my colleague understands and I don't, to do a significant layering of mapping to look at locations of buildings that are owned by a local or state government and are 2 or 3 stories, but have zoning implications that mean that they could be 4 or 5 or 6 stories. So that's not about finding, well, it is, it's about finding underutilized buildings. It's where are we at building at a certain height and we could build higher. That kind of thing you can automate if you're super smart, like Dr. Matthew Palm. And if not, it's tricky. You can look at water records as well. That's what they do in Prosperity Australia, with their looking at underutilized housing. So there's different ways, but there's no kind of consolidated mechanism.
No, fantastic. Thank you. How do we stay involved and work together through networks and things like that?
I love this. That's more of a question for Iha, I guess.
Yeah, great. We've got Iha lined up right next. Yep. That's all the questions. Thank you so much, Kate.
No worries. Thank you. And I will pass over to Councillor Rebecca Patterson now to finalise things. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me just flick to the right page. So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Patterson and I'm a councillor with Monash City Council and also the chair of the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance. Kate, thank you so much for your presentation today. Answering all of those wonderful questions from people in the chat. I just want to remind everyone to please access the support services that are available in the chat if you need to after today. And on behalf of EHA, I'd like to very sincerely thank Kate and the whole team at Umvelt for undertaking this amazing research. And Kate's passion and work ethic has really been the driving force throughout this project. We're really, really proud of this work. That's an understatement. We're so happy to be a part of it. It feels like such a significant and important piece of work for organisations like EHA and the Eastern Metro region to be undertaking. So we're really excited to share the final report with you on our website, on the EHA website next week. And Catherine is
I'm so sorry.
No,
folks. I'm
you
just
don't
trying to
have to
stop the sharing so we could see your face.
That's all right.
And it's hard to do when you're ducking down.
Yeah, that's okay.
And it's the most terrible mouse.
It is. I agree. It's a pretty terrible mouse. You've been pressing that button a lot and it's not working. Look,
You're good. Okay, sorry everyone.
no, that's okay. I'm sure everybody understands that we all have a lot of technological challenges to deal with as we do this. So thank you for your patience. But so the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance is a formal collaboration of 6 councils in Melbourne's east, working together to ensure everyone with low to moderate incomes in the region can access safe, secure and affordable housing. So speaking to that idea of how do we stay involved and work together, this is just one way that local councils in the Eastern region are continuing to work together. And I encourage you to keep up with all of our emails and check our website. And if you ever want to come and speak to EHA or speak at EHA, we'd love to hear from you if you've got an interest in affordable housing. So I'd like to thank all of the 6 member councils for their support. So that's Knox, Manningham, Maroondah, Monash, Whitehorse and Yarra Ranges. This project came out of the Eastern Affordable Housing Alliance's desire to find real ways to prevent the rapid decline into homelessness for older women in our region and hopefully even wider. The work doesn't end here. We'll keep unpacking these findings and consider where we take it to next. We don't want this to just be an interesting report that goes into a filing cabinet. So we want to continue our advocacy and working together with all of you in partnership to address homelessness, particularly for this cohort who are so vulnerable to housing insecurity. We're really thankful for the funding and support provided by the Victorian Government through the Metro Partnerships Development Fund, and we look forward to working together with them further in tackling this complex issue. I also want to say thanks to Knox City Council, and in particular to Camille and to Catherine for managing the project delivery. And a big thank you to the project working group, which comprised representatives from the EHA councils, as well as the Victorian Government Department of Jobs, Skills, Industry and Regions, the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, Launch Housing, Women's Property Initiatives, and the Eastern Region Group of Councils. We absolutely value everyone who has shared their insights and given time toward this project. There were over 120 participants in total, so thank you. The project has tapped into the strong energy across our region to prevent older women's homelessness and formed many new connections. As Kate has demonstrated, we will need to draw on these, we will all need to draw on this energy and these connections going forward. I want to end with the biggest thank you of all. A very special thank you to the women who shared from their direct experiences of homelessness and gave their valuable time toward this project. Without your expertise and passion, this project wouldn't be what it is. You are the heart of this project, and you will remain the heart of further work based on these findings. So thank you very much for sharing your journey. I want to say thank you to everyone for attending today, and thank you for your patience with our technical issues. So please click on the link in the chat to provide feedback on the session, and maybe go easier on the technical feedback. But no, just kidding. We'd really love your feedback on the session or the project. So please do click on the link to provide that to us. So stay tuned for an announcement about the final report published on EHA's website next week. And follow EHA on LinkedIn. We've recently become quite active in that space, and I know many of you are on there, and it tends to be a space that's a little bit more collaborative and positive than some of the other social media sites. So I encourage you to use that to stay involved with what we're doing. And we hope to be able to connect with you again around this issue, and you can always reach out to us if you like. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday, everyone. Bye.